Hello, my name is Paul Eastman. I'm the pastor of the Streetlight Christian Church, and I welcome you to this series of lectures or lessons about how to live as a Christian. And these are lessons that are taken from the Heidelberg Catechism. We are in the section of the Heidelberg Catechism which deals with Christian ethics, how a Christian behaves, and we are in the section about the law of God. And we have looked 2 weeks ago at the preface of the law. The preface, actually, it was 3 weeks ago, because 2 weeks ago it was Ascension Day. But when we looked at the preface, we looked at the foundation upon which the law of God is built. The law of God is built upon God's right to command us. And he says, this is my right. It is the right of love. I have loved you. And I've acted out of my love for you, my compassion for you. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That is the preface of the law. God says, I have saved you. You don't have to do anything to be saved. I've done it all. You don't have to keep the law in order to be saved. I've done it for you already. And here's my law. It's not a law unto salvation. It's a law that flows out of your salvation. It's the law that flows out of the freedom that I have already given to you. It's the law that leads you into a deeper life of blessing and a relationship of love with me and with one another. So it is the law of love. The preface emphasizes that, and Jesus confirms that when he says that love is the fulfillment of the law of God, the 10 Commandments. Today I want to look at the second commandment. And the second commandment is very nicely connected to the first commandment. And I want to just take just a moment to reflect with you on the relationship between the first and the second commandment. And to do it, I want to just illustrate that with sticky notes with the letters O-H-W. O-H-W. Now, I'm not sure. Let's see, can we pronounce that? Oh, yeah, that's not a word. You know, these 3 letters, you can rearrange it in 6 different ways. I've spent a lot of time figuring that out, but 6 different combinations. You can go, oh, that's not one of the words. Almost ow. But when I think about the first commandment, then I think that this is the right combination that represents that. When we talk about the first commandment, we're asking about who. We're asking, or God is telling us who it is that we should worship. You shall have no other gods before me, because the person whom you should worship is Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the first commandment deals with the question, who? And perhaps you remember last time we talked about how the first commandment is like the first floor of a 10-story building. And in the first commandment, God is dealing with the question, or God is saying, this is the most important matter of all. If you don't get this right, then you've got no hope. That everything falls to the ground and there's no stability left. So the most important of all questions is who, but we looked at that last week. We have to make sure that we are worshiping the only God, the God revealed in the Bible, the God so beautifully revealed by Jesus Christ. The second commandment, however, deals with a different matter, but these 3 letters will help us. The second commandment deals with the question of The second commandment deals with the question of how. So the first is about who we worship, and the second is about how we worship Him. And the how is really, really important. I cannot overemphasize how important the matter of how is, because God is very, very concerned about it. God is really passionate about it. He says in the second commandment, He says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath and the waters under the earth." So you're not allowed to create an image, three-dimensional, one-dimensional, or even three-dimensional, two-dimensional, or imaginary. You're not to create something graphically sculptured, painted, or something in your mind. Not to have a talisman around your neck and say, "This is my God," or "This is how I worship God. I worship God through this little cross on my neck, or this stone in my pocket," or something like that. You're not allowed to worship God through objects. You're not allowed to attach God's glory to an object, whether physical or imaginary. The Heidelberg Catechism explains that when it points out creatures may be portrayed. This is Lord's Day 35, answer 95. It says, "Creatures may be portrayed, but God forbids us to make or have any images of them in order to worship them or to serve God through them." So God says, when it's good that you worship me, it's good that you keep the first commandment, but you have to worship me in the right way. How you worship really matters. You are not allowed to use images. And God warns us that if you do, that's going to cause trouble for a very, very long time. If you do, that's going to cause just so much trouble. Because God says, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them," these images that you might create. You're not allowed to do that because I am a jealous God. And I'm jealous for my bride. What man isn't jealous for his bride? What man doesn't become angry when another man begins to flirt with his woman? And what woman doesn't become jealous when another woman comes and begins to lead astray and to try to win the affections of her man? God cannot endure that either. And He is a jealous God because He loves us. And He says, "If you worship me in the wrong way, then I will visit that iniquity, that sin upon the fathers, upon the children, to the third and fourth generation of those that hate me." Because if you're not worshiping me in the right way, you don't show that you love me. In fact, you show that you hate me, God says. And when you begin to imagine your own ways to worship God instead of listening to God and doing what He says, then God says that that's going to be a really big problem that you're not going to be able to get rid of for a very long time. It'll become an institution in your community that has won the hearts and the minds of the people that they will not be able to let go again for a very long time, for 3 or 4 generations. Because you see, when we start to worship God on the basis of what we imagine to be the best way, instead of listening to God and saying, "God, how do you want us to worship you? I want to read in the Bible the right way to worship." When we begin to imagine for ourselves how we should worship God, then problems arise, big problems. False worship, false patterns of worship, even if you're worshiping the true God, a false pattern of worship is the slipperiest slope you can ever try to stand on. You cannot stand on that slope. Israel found this out many times. Two times, very famous. At the foot of the Mount Sinai, Moses was up on the mountain. He was receiving the law, the 10 Commandments from God. and all kinds of other details. And Israel was wondering what happened to Moses, and they said, Moses has disappeared, and they told Aaron, we want to worship God in our own ways. We don't want to wait for God to tell us how to worship him. We want to decide on our own patterns, even though God had already said, there's one pattern I don't want you to do. I don't want you to make an image to worship me through it. But Israel said, how do they do that? It's just part of human sinfulness, I guess. But they said to Aaron, make us a golden image of a cow, of a calf, and we want to worship God through it. And so they did. And they threw a festival in honor of God. They could worship God in this new and exciting way. And that festival quickly broke down into all kinds of sinful practices that resembled paganism rather than true worship. And judgment fell upon Israel very heavily on account of that. It was a really bad example of how paganism is closely tied to any false patterns of worship. And that's confirmed later on in Israel's history. David was the greatest king, a man after God's own heart who reigned over Israel. And his son Solomon became more glorious than David, very rich and very and tremendous influence in the ancient world in which Solomon lived. But Solomon became unfaithful, and at the end of his life he built places of worship for Molech and for Asherah and for Baal and for Ra and for all kinds of other false gods, because he had married women who worshipped these false gods, and he had to provide places of worship for them, or he felt he had to. Consequently, Israel became very used to and acquainted with false patterns of worship. And when they learned about them from these wives of Solomon and saw those things being practiced in those pagan shrines, they wanted them too. And so God was angry at Solomon for allowing this to happen. And when Solomon died, God tore away the kingdom from the family of David. So David's grandson, he only had a very small part of Israel to reign over. And the northern kingdom broke away from David's throne. And they built shrines in the north and the south kingdom separate from Jerusalem, and they put images there so they could worship God through those images. And it wasn't and almost immediately after that, Israel begins to worship false gods, Baal and Asherah and the gods of the people around them. So the point is that when you begin to break the right patterns of worship, when you don't worship the way God tells us to, we can say, well, I'm worshiping the true God. I'm just doing it my own way. God says, no, you're not allowed to do that, because when you start to do it your own way, you're on a path that will inevitably lead you away from me. It's the slipperiest slope a man can stand on. The hold which false patterns of worship have on a person's heart is illustrated by Paul's experience as described in the book of Acts. I read through the book of Acts recently, and I was quite impressed by this message which Luke seems to be giving. Every time that the Apostle Paul went to a new community, he first went to the synagogue. So when he traveled through Asia Minor and then through Macedonia and then through Greece, he went first of all in every town he came to. He went to the synagogue in Antioch, in Lystra and Iconium, in Derbe, in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth. He always went first to the synagogue. Athens is the only place where he didn't do that, but that's quite a different story. And when he went to the synagogue, then the Jews listened to him as he preached the gospel of Jesus Christ. And people have a certain love for the truth. We all love the truth. We all love what's honest and what's pure and what's good. And so people listened to Paul as he talked about Jesus Christ, and they were drawn to the message that Paul brought. And it said, Jesus is the fulfillment of all the scriptures, and people were moved. But after a while, in the second and the third week that Paul was preaching, people began to realize, but if Jesus really is the Messiah, then that means that everything has to change, and also the patterns of worship. That means that the patterns of worship that we're following now are no longer valid. And the patterns of worship that we follow are so important to us. You might not realize it, but it is. And we have a hard time abandoning patterns of worship just because they're wrong. We may recognize certain truths and we may gravitate toward them, but if they involve a requirement for us to change the way that we worship, we resist that very much. And so they resisted the Apostle Paul, and in one community after another, they began to resist him, and they began to oppose him, and they began to hate him. In Antioch, they were so angry, they stoned him. They thought that he was dead, and they left him in the field. He wasn't dead. He got up and he went to the next community. But that's the kind of behavior that he experienced in one community after another. In Antioch, in Iconium, in Thessalonica, in Berea, even in Corinth, although he wasn't physically assaulted there by the Jewish people in opposition to the need to change the patterns of worship. But you see, there you have it. How you worship is so important. Because once you follow a bad pattern of worship, once you start to imagine the way that you should worship and you don't listen to God and say to him, God, please show me how I should worship you from your word. When we don't do that and we start to imagine from our own minds how we should worship, we're gonna wander far from God, and it's gonna be really hard to get back. We are living right now in a very strange time. I'm speaking to you right now on June the 2nd, and it's been over 11 weeks now since the Streetlight Christian Church has gathered together for worship on Sunday. And that's the key way in which we worship God. The most important way for worshiping him is to gather together as the community, because God instructs us from the Bible to do that, and to listen to the preaching of the gospel, and to celebrate God's grace with song and with prayer and with with offerings, and to receive God's grace through the sacraments. I mean, there's so many ways in which we are able to worship God richly, but in this COVID world, we're not able to do that at all. Not at all anymore. We have online worship, but there's a lot of people that are just unable to participate in that. So how do we obey God in terms of the second commandment in a COVID world? It's very difficult. And frankly, it has become impossible for us to obey the second commandment, because we're not free to do it anymore on account of this pandemic. Not on account of persecution. There's a lot of places where that's the case, but because of a broken world, a pandemic that's afflicting our communities. May God give us the freedom soon, so that we may worship him in simple obedience to the second commandment. And may it fill our hearts to obey the second commandment. May it fill our prayers that God would grant us the freedom to worship him again. May that come soon. Thank you for listening to this lesson on the second commandment, and I look forward next time, the third commandment, of course. We're going to talk about the use of the name of God. And God says, do not take my name in vain. So until next time, thank you for listening. Goodbye.